Iran's military defenses have already been shattered by the precision strikes of US stealth bombers and cutting-edge fifth-generation fighter jets, which have dismantled much of the country's defensive capabilities. Now, a new force has entered the skies, the iconic B-52 Stratofortress, a bomber with a storied history that spans 74 years. Iran now faces a new formidable threat as this veteran aircraft unleashes a relentless and devastating assault on its infrastructure. The Iranian regime is coming to terms with the grim reality. The war is slipping further out of their grasp as B-52s pulverize everything in their path with overwhelming firepower. This development underscores a brilliant American strategy. The U.S. is preparing for a protracted campaign designed to dismantle Iran's regime once and for all. If you're curious to understand the depth of this tactical genius and what it means for the conflict ahead, stay with us as we dive deeper. The arrival of the B-52s marks the latest and most significant chapter in the ongoing Iran conflict. This large, unmistakable bomber now operates with near impunity in Iranian airspace, a clear signal that Tehran's air defenses are effectively neutralized. Not even the advanced radar systems can detect or intercept it, proving the Iranian defenses are overwhelmed and powerless to halt the U.S. as it brings one of its oldest non-stealth bombers into the fight to further escalate the damage. To put this into perspective, initially, the U.S. penetrated Iranian defenses with stealth bombers and a swarm of American and Israeli fighter jets working in tandem to breach the skies. Now, with the B-52 wide-scale deployment, these bombers are systematically bombing every remaining Iranian military installation into oblivion. This marks a strategic shift from precise surgical strikes to sheer brute force, underscoring the escalating intensity of the campaign. This might sound surprising, especially considering that the U.S. and Israel launched a staggering 1,000 targeted strikes in the first 24 hours of this latest phase of conflict. However, those initial bombings were surgical operations, carefully calibrated and supported by advanced cyber warfare tactics, such as jamming and spoofing Iranian radar networks to blind their response capability. This electronic assault was followed by precise strikes that shattered air defenses, sank naval assets, and eliminated key aerial forces. The U.S. and Israeli forces also executed decapitation attacks aimed at the regime's leadership, climaxing in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, delivering a symbolic and strategic blow. Those opening hours were a meticulously executed storm of surgical precision designed to disorient and devastate Iranian military command and control. Yet this onslaught was only the beginning. A strategic foundation was laid for something far more overwhelming. Now, with the initial surgical strikes accomplished, the U.S. is shifting gears, pounding Iran with punishing sledgehammer attacks that exploit the vulnerabilities created. Iran finds itself powerless to respond. The B-52 bombers have entered the fray, and shortly, we will explain in detail exactly what roles they are playing in this theater of war. But first, consider the immense firepower these bombers bring to the battlefield. Unlike the stealthy B-2 bombers, which have already undertaken marathon 30-hour-plus bombing missions over Iran, the B-52 operates without stealth technology. It cannot evade detection by enemy radars or air defenses like its ultra-modern and costly B-2 counterpart Doid. However, the B-52 excels in a different domain. Once air superiority is established, as it is now, it can deliver devastatingly heavy and precise strikes on ground targets. Boasting a payload capacity of about 70,000 pounds, the B-52 can load up with an array of precision-guided munitions. This capability allows the U.S. to systematically obliterate the remaining fragments of Iran's defenses and military infrastructure. Military analysts, including Max Afterburner, have taken a closer look at the B-52's role in this campaign, revealing the strategic impact of integrating these powerful bombers into the existing battle plan. Their contribution represents an escalation not just in firepower, but in America's long-term commitment to dismantling Iran's military capabilities comprehensively and decisively. Let's talk about the arrival of the B-52 bombers in Iran. These aircraft are real heavy hitters on the battlefield. To put it into perspective, a single B-52 can carry up to 70 JDAMs, Joint Direct Attack Munitions. Just the sheer number of jams these bombers can deploy says a lot about their firepower. These highly accurate guided air-to-surface weapons come in 3 weight classes: 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, and 2,000 pounds. Assuming the B-52s deployed to Iran loaded with the 1,000-pound JDAMs, which seems likely, this gives us an idea of the destructive capability they bring. However, as Afterburner points out, that choice might not always be optimal. Even though the U.S. has established air superiority, there remains the risk of isolated surface-to-air missile attacks that could target a B-52. Afterburner provides insight into the current aerial landscape over Iran. While Iran's air defense network has been severely damaged, it's not completely wiped out. This means that single, sporadic threats remain. To mitigate these residual dangers, America's B-52s likely carry JASSMs, or Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles. These subsonic missiles have a strikingly long range, capable of traveling anywhere between 230 and 575 miles based on variant. This enables the B-52s to launch attacks from distances beyond the reach of Iran's remaining air defenses, staying safely out of harm's way. Now think back to what we mentioned earlier about the evolving role of the B-52s in Iran. The US B-2 Spirit stealth bombers first conducted precise and surgical strikes, carving out a battlefield environment that allows the B-52s to operate with relative impunity. With the B-2s softening targets and disrupting defenses, the older but still formidable B-52s move in. Afterburner explains that these bombers are currently focusing on Iran's crucial command and control C2 nodes, the nerve centers that Iran's military depends on to manage and coordinate its defense operations. As Afterburner describes, Iran's ability to coordinate its military response is deteriorating rapidly. Once one of these command nodes is destroyed, Iranian missile launches become isolated events, lacking the guidance and support to be effective. Moreover, production sites for replenishing missile stockpiles are themselves targeted, resulting in drastically slowed reload time. Repairs and rebuilding of damaged facilities are practically impossible right now. Simply put, the B-52s are targeting the key nodes that enable Iran to wield what remains of its major threat: ballistic missile attacks against the US. Before we dive further into Iran's missile capabilities, let's consider confirmation from other sources. The war zone, often abbreviated as SUZIs, concurs with Afterburner's assessment that American B-52s are inflicting serious damage on Iran's C2 infrastructure. They cite comments from Air Force General Dan Kane, who characterizes Iran's command and control systems as being in dire shape. A significant factor behind this is the strategic shift from large, deliberate standoff strike packages to more direct, precision strikes in Iran's airspace. General Kane notes that by the 4th day of operation, Strategic Command has moved beyond just using standoff munitions delivered from outside enemy range. Now they're employing persistent precision attacks over Iran itself. To sum up, it's less about choosing between precision or power at this stage, and more about combining both in a new phase of the conflict. The effects have already been devastating for Iran. The arrival of the B-52 bombers has escalated the campaign to a whole new level, and the results on the ground and in Iran's command infrastructure are profound. We can keenly observe this shift in how the U.S. is disrupting Iran's military capabilities and bringing substantial pressure on its systems. Right after the initial flurry of 1,000 strikes in the first 24 hours, the United States, alongside Israel, ramped up their efforts by doubling the strike volume. Within just the first 72 hours of the conflict, these two allies combined forces to obliterate over 2,000 targets inside Iran. The B-52 bombers have been central to this escalation, relentlessly launching standoff munitions against targets left vulnerable due to Iran's air defense network, which was significantly weaker than expected from the outset. According to reports from PBS News, Iran's health ministry stated that as of March 4th, approximately 920 people have been killed, though it remains unclear whether these fatalities include civilians, military personnel, or both. Other sources, like the Jerusalem Post, estimate that over 1,000 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were eliminated in the initial wave of strikes. Considering this, it is reasonable to infer that even more Iranian forces have been taken out now that America's B-52 bombers have intensified the offensive. The destructive power unleashed is staggering. Yet, beyond sheer devastation, perhaps the most profound impact of America's bombers has been felt on the defensive front. Earlier, we noted that the U.S. B-52s primarily target Iran's command and control, or C2, nodes. In a traditional ground war, such nodes are critical for coordinating troops and logistics. But this conflict isn't a ground war. As we highlighted earlier, Iran's strategic advantage in this fight largely stems from its vast stockpile of ballistic missiles. According to Iran Watch, the United States Central Command estimated this stockpile to consist of over 3,000 missiles as of 2022. It is likely that Iran has already expended a significant portion of these missiles through attacks on Israel and US military bases, both before and during the ongoing conflict. As hostilities began, the Israel Defense Forces assessed Iran's inventory at roughly 2,500 missiles, a daunting arsenal by any measure. Thanks to the persistent efforts of the B-52s, however, Iran has been unable to effectively capitalize on these missile reserves. By dismantling Iran's command and control infrastructure, US forces have disrupted the coordination necessary for missile launches. This, coupled with targeted strikes on missile launch sites, has effectively crippled the one major element of power projection that Iran possesses. This disruption is reflected in hard numbers. In a March 4th report by CNN, updates from a central command revealed that Iran's ballistic missile capabilities are steadily being diminished. During a statement at the Pentagon, spokesperson Kah announced that as of that morning, there was an 86% reduction in Iran's theater ballistic missile launches compared to the first day of fighting. Moreover, in just the preceding 24 hours alone, missile launches declined by 23%. In addition, Iran's one-way attack drones have been shot down at a rate of 73%. What we're witnessing is a methodical dismantling of Iran's entire military strategy, with the deployment of B-52 bombers playing a pivotal role. But remember, earlier in this video, we mentioned that the decision to send in B-52s was a masterstroke by the U.S. military. This decimation of Iran's offensive capabilities is undeniably important. Yet it is not the sole reason why deploying the B-52s was such a brilliant move. There is more to this strategy than mere destruction alone. Let's dive deeper into why the arrival of the B-52 is such a brilliant strategic move for the United States. But before we get into that, if you want this kind of detailed insight regularly, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show. Every week we break down complex military developments just like this. So, why is the B-52's deployment so clever? On March 2nd, as President Donald Trump gave us a crucial hint. He suggested that the conflict with Iran might last far longer than many expect. While the official U.S. projection estimated the war to span about 4 to 5 weeks, Trump emphasized that the U.S. military is fully prepared to sustain operations well beyond that timeline. In other words, the U.S. is gearing up for a protracted multi-week, possibly even multi-month engagement, and we're still just at the very start. Given this reality, the United States must prepare for the costs and logistics of a drawn-out conflict. That means efficiently managing expenses while continuing to apply overwhelming firepower on Iran. And this is precisely where the genius of using B-52 bombers instead of the newer, stealthier B-2s becomes crystal clear. It's easy to imagine the U.S. military as an unstoppable juggernaut with unlimited funds. But the truth is more pragmatic. The U.S. government and military leaders want to avoid spending money irresponsibly during a prolonged campaign. Using expensive assets where cheaper alternatives suffice would be strategically unwise. One potential financial pitfall would have been relying on the B-2 Spirit bombers for all bombing missions. But 1945 magazine sums it up perfectly when it explains why B-52s are stepping into the spotlight. Capable of carrying large volumes of precision-guided munitions, the B-52 has a long loiter time and costs less per hour to operate than the B-2. This means that for sustained bombardment, especially once airspace becomes accessible without heavy enemy resistance, the B-52 is the ideal choice. Right now, Iran's skies are relatively permissive, which suits the B-52's strengths perfectly. When you look at operational costs, W details that the B-2 costs about twice as much as the B-52 just to get airborne. The B-2's stealth technology and maintenance-intensive coatings make it best suited for high-impact precision strike missions in the opening phases of a campaign. Those surgical initial attacks we've seen so far. After delivering those strikes, the B-2 typically pulls back, allowing other bombers like the B-52 to take over prolonged missions. There's also a direct cost factor to consider in building and replacing these bombers. A single B-2 costs around $2 billion to develop and manufacture. So losing a B-2 in combat or to mechanical failure over Iran would create a significant budgetary black hole during this campaign. In stark contrast, the B-52 fleet is undergoing an extensive modernization program that had already cost $15 billion by 2021. This is part of the larger $48.60 billion effort to keep these venerable bombers in service through 2060. Currently, the U.S. operates 76 B-52 bombers. Including recent and ongoing upgrades, the operational cost for each B-52 is about $640, not including the original production cost from over 70 years ago. Adjusted for inflation, that original figure was around $1.14 billion. This all means the B-52 represents less financial risk, while still providing massive firepower and endurance. In summary, the B-52 combines lower operational costs, the capability for heavy ordnance loads, and suitability for sustained missions in permissive airspace. This makes it a smart, cost-effective backbone for a long-term air campaign against Iran. If you consider all these factors, the clever shift toward deploying B-52s becomes clear. It's about balancing firepower, endurance, and budgetary prudence in what would be a costly and extended conflict. Losing an aircraft is always costly, but the price of losing a B-1 bomber, for example, pales in comparison to the far greater expense and technological sophistication of a B-2 stealth bomber. This is crucial when considering operational costs. According to the national interest, each sortie of a B-2 bomber racks up around $200,000. During the surgical segment of its strike campaign in Iran, the U.S. had B-2s airborne for over 30 hours, which adds up to more than $6 million for just that single mission. In sharp contrast, the B-52 bomber costs approximately $70,000 per flight hour, about half the B-2's rate even after adjusting for inflation, just as W highlighted earlier. From a purely financial viewpoint, pivoting to the B-52 is a clever strategy. It enables the United States to sustain a heavy bombardment with advanced weaponry while shouldering a significantly smaller cost burden on the defense budget. If the Trump administration is gearing up for a prolonged campaign, possibly lasting 4 to 5 weeks, this switch was essential to keep the operation going smoothly. Turning our attention to the current situation, Iran is undeniably vulnerable. We've glimpsed parts of this, especially regarding Iran's ballistic missile capabilities and the condition of its air defense systems, but it's worth exploring their air defenses in more detail. Compared to Western standards, Iran's integrated air defense system is markedly inferior. Afterburner notes that even before bombings began, Iran's air defenses, composed of Chinese and Russian surface-to-air missile systems and radars, were being decimated by B-52s and other American bombers. Iran stood at a distinct disadvantage in the air defense battle before the conflict escalated. Army Technology shed further light in their March 3rd article, revealing that much of Iran's air defense network isn't even composed of the original Chinese and Russian units. Instead, many are inexpensive copies of Russia's S-300 and China's HQ-7 systems that Iran reverse-engineered into its own version. Until now, these knockoff systems were untested in real combat. Their performance in battle, however, has been disappointing. To make matters worse, merely reverse engineering without incorporating improvements means Iran's replicas share the same weaknesses as their originals. Take, for instance, Iran's copies of the S-300 systems. They remain vulnerable to Israeli weaponry, like the Icebreaker missile, which exploits electronic warfare weaknesses in the S-300 radars. Iran neglected to address these vulnerabilities in its cloned systems and is now paying a steep price. Presently, Iran's already fragile air defense network has deteriorated further. Reports from Newsweek suggest that Iran is repositioning air defenses from east to west, bracing for potential attacks originating from the Western Front. This constant shifting highlights the strain and insecurity facing Iran's defense strategy amid ongoing aerial assaults. But don't mistake this for a decisive power move. What it really means is that Iran's eastern territory is becoming accessible for America's B-52 bombers to launch standoff munitions from a flank that Iran has left less defended. While Tehran and Isfahan may have seen some improvements in their defenses after the initial series of strikes, these measures fall far short of effectively countering the persistent U.S. and Israeli attack. As Afterburner insightfully points out, Iran's strategy essentially boils down to hoping for occasional successful strikes born from American complacency. This isn't a robust air defense plan by any stretch. It's a risky gamble, and one that is unlikely to yield the high returns Iran desperately needs. On the U.S. side, the situation is one of near total air superiority. This isn't quite air supremacy, the condition where a nation operates with absolute confidence, knowing it will face no resistance in enemy airspace. But it's close enough for the U.S. to begin deploying non-stealth bombers over Iran with relative assurance. This move is a clear show of American confidence, a reality that Tehran definitely did not want to confront. It signals that President Trump's assertions about a campaign extending over several weeks are not empty threats. Expect a significant increase in strikes delivered by the formidable B-52 fleet. And that's without even factoring in the U.S. carrier strike groups active in the Persian Gulf area, bringing along dozens of fighter jets and a wide array of supporting aircraft. As the campaign marches forward, the conflict scope is already broadening, especially within Iran itself. Afterburner notes that the arrival of the B-52s marks a distinct shift toward greater volume and persistence of attacks. But the widening scope is not limited to Iran's interior. It also involves an expansion in both the geographical reach of US strikes and the targets under consideration. For example, on March 4th, the U.S. launched a torpedo attack against the Iris Dana in international waters off Sri Lanka's southern coast, a location far removed from the Persian Gulf. This incident highlights a strategic extension of the U.S. campaign against Iranian military assets positioned beyond Iran's borders. Moreover, there looms the possibility of the U.S. deploying ground troops into Iran. According to Chatham House, such a move would likely be necessary if the ultimate objective is to overthrow the Iranian regime. While President Trump talks about supporting the Iranian people in rising up against the theocracy, this rhetoric sounds more like hopeful, wishful thinking rather than a concrete strategy. There's little evidence yet of a strong domestic opposition or defections from the regime, according to think tanks. This suggests that Iranians themselves may lack the confidence or capability to dismantle the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran's senior leadership. This brings us to a compelling consideration. Perhaps the deployment of B-52s and the anticipation of weeks of relentless strikes are paving the way for a third, even more consequential phase of the conflict with Iran. First, there was the surgical precision of initial strikes. Then came the overwhelming impact of sustained bombardment. The next phase might well represent an escalation beyond what we have seen so far, the nature of which remains to be revealed. The idea of us soldiers overwhelming the Iranian regime on the ground is a pivotal concept. What we can say with certainty is that Iran's regime has been shaken deeply, perhaps to the point of never fully recovering. This is obviously disastrous news for the regime itself, but it also spells significant trouble for Putin. It has been betting heavily on the growing alliance between Russia and Iran to boost his stature as a major global geopolitical force. If the Iranian regime collapses, it would deliver a substantial setback to Putin's ambitions. Curious about the details? Check out our dedicated video for a deeper dive. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all our coverage of Operation Epic Fury. Thank you for watching.